Hello, everybody, and welcome to our discussion on gender identity and bias, letters of recommendation. This short presentation focuses on looking and examining a few aspects of how gender identity and bias is reflected in our construction, our review, and our engagement with students as they apply for different awards, scholarships, graduate schools, or other opportunities. The presentation will also be in light and connected to some resources that are available for you, and I look forward to having discussions in our roundtable conversation spaces as you go through this information. To begin, I just want to amplify a statement and kind of space for an Indigenous peoples statement that was provided and shared with me from and by one of our colleagues, Alexis Ramsey. I'm very appreciative of the time that she took to craft this. And I do want to acknowledge that Eckerd College and the work, learning, and living we do is on the traditional territory of the Tocobaga and the Seminole tribes, and that we honor these tribes and other indigenous caretakers of these lands and waters, the elders who lived here before, the indigenous today, and the generations to come. I also want to state that I identify as a white, cisgendered, able bodied woman. This discussion, as I mentioned, will be structured around issues related to the manner that gender bias, implicit and explicit, appears in our recommendation documents, and the fashion that we provide and structure these recommendations based on both implicit and explicit gender and identity concepts. This conversation is part of a longer one that I've been having in my role, where I facilitate different opportunities for students, and I do a lot of connections with external organizations too. And what I kept coming up against was that there was a big push in a lot of these documents that seemed to favor one gender over the other, or at least propose some different ideas related to bias and both implicit and explicit issues. The big concept that kept coming up were kind of in these areas that researchers have identified in both content and intent. And so some of the things that we often see when we're writing letters or when we are reviewing letters is that there are some stereotypical and grindstone adjectives that appear. And these are adjectives that are used to both describe male and female applicants, and they're often very much based in gender stereotypes. Men are seen as successful, women as nurturing. Words like compassionate are going to be more frequently aligned to women, where words like accomplishment are going to be used more for masculine identities. This also appeared in regards to the use of grindstone words, adjectives that describe applicants as hard workers, the sense of effort, right, were often used for women more so than for men, implying that women have to have this strong work ethic, whereas men have to have the ability. And these stereotypical and grindstone adjectives appear and are used often implicitly and explicitly without really kind of a lot of forethought. Also, the repetition of standout words, words and phrases that we repeat that creates this cohesion and really is a very effective persuasive rhetorical device. Superlatives and status words like outstanding, research, that really become repeated over and over again often appear more in letters describing men than women. And that is something that we want to start to think about and push into and explore. In addition, doubt raisers. Letters recommending women are twice as likely to include doubt raisers. It appears that her motivation is strong or that her health is stable. The kind of empty or open space where you're attempting to explain something, but it doesn't really explain it, it just raises doubts. And these often occur more often in letters written for men than more for women. The last one is that intent, right? Both in content and intent, letters and support documentation appear much more focused on describing the positive qualities of men in their role as researcher and professional, whereas letters describe the positive qualities of women, emphasizing that teaching or that engagement. The pronoun her is more often followed by training, teaching, personal life more than his. Similarly, his is often followed by research, skills, publications, than was her. And this type of stereotypical grindstone adjectives, repetition of standout words, doubt raisers, and of course that idea that certain types of activities are tied to certain types of pronouns really does affect how we react when we look at a letter of recommendation, when we start to evaluate. Um, and we really want to think in a way that we need to consider when we're doing this, that it's not just, for a support document, but that we're really establishing and supporting a tone and building a foundation for future engagement. And so a lot of research is being done in this field, and it really does focus on some ways of kind of checking yourself first, of establishing a good frame so that when you go into writing a letter of recommendation or a support document, that you're kind of in a good headspace. Now, I know we're all coming at these letters. Sometimes 20, 30 of them are in the email waiting for you to take care of. So I want to really acknowledge this invisible work that is often done that isn't always privileged in the same way it should be. And I want to also suggest that we need to think about it in a way that still acknowledges that work you're doing, but also allows you to kind of develop and more accurately and aptly address these concerns of gender identity bias. And so this is a short little overview in a sense of what you can kind of do so that you have that awareness, or at least you develop that awareness. The first one is just to focus. So look at the requirements of the job or the requirements of the position or the requirements of the opportunity and compare the applicant with those requirements. And when describing, in a sense, like specifically female traits, ask yourself if those are relevant to the job, or are you missing something else, or vice versa, the same with the masculine traits. Avoid overusing those gendered or grindstone adjectives or those constructions. Avoid also unnecessarily invoking a stereotype or something that really does, even if you're saying she's not too emotional, it still evokes something that is creating and supporting those notions of bias. Use titles and surnames for both men and women instead of first names, unless first names are standard in the field, right? And remember that it's usually important to talk about the personality and interpersonal skills of the applicant, right? That you can do that, but don't overly focus on them. Instead, really consider and contemplate what that individual is bringing. There have been a lot of kind of studies that have looked at comparisons of letters of recommendation for male and females in different positions. And it occurs. It occurs throughout the academy. It occurs throughout the professional environment. And we really need to be cognizant of how we can really think about bias in regards to both conscious, right, like we just talked about, but also unconscious. So when you think about the application materials and review process, when someone comes to you and says, I want some feedback, or I would like you to write me a letter of recommendation, or both, you really want to consider that the name, test scores, the letters of rec, the other extracurricular activities, so much more really does buttress the notion of bias. And specifically in most studies testing unconscious bias theories, the subject or individuals that the unconscious bias favored tend to be from those majority identities, the white, the male, higher socioeconomic status, etc. So if we have this already in our mind when we're going into this, we really want to consider and really give space to the notion that unconscious bias can influence our decisions. They make us unknowingly favor one type of applicant over another or discredit other applicants unfairly. In short, they have real world consequences. For example, in a 2011 study, white students have a 40% higher chance of receiving private scholarships than students of color. And then when adjusting for differences in financial need, white students receiving federal Pell Grants still receive private scholarships more often than students of color receiving Pell Grants. And in terms of funding specifically, designated as merit-based, white students are still receiving 3 times more grant and scholarship funding than students of color. Um, a different study published in 2015 also found that the emails sent from prospective students signaled as white males received email responses sooner than all other categories of students. The study sent near identical emails from fake prospective students to over 6,500 university professors. The names used to sign the emails were randomly picked to signal gender and race. For both of these studies, it is possible that some of the individuals awarding scholarships or delaying their email responses were acting on explicit biases, right? But it's more likely that a larger portion were most likely acting on their own unconscious bias that ended up favoring white male students. When reviewing applications, you need to think about kind of where you're coming from and be aware that there is unconscious bias there. And it's hard to address it, and it takes work, and you're not always going to get it right. We never will, but we can try, and we can attempt it, and there's some strategies to do that. There is no way to eliminate it, but being aware allows us to begin to learn to mitigate them. Although we cannot do much individually, we can work as a community to reduce the impact of our biases collectively. When we are part of teams and groups and organizations, we have more opportunities to mitigate and counteract these biases for one another. We can check each other. There are several different strategies for addressing. There's SEEDS, the Similarity, Expedience, Experience, Distance, and Safety Model, and the COST, C-O-S-T, Corner Cutting, Objectivism, Self-Protection, and Money Bias Model. And both of these different types of models, i.e. confirmation biases, into categories, and then offer mitigating structures for each of these categories. There's a great search committee guide created by Women in Science and Engineering Leadership Institute, and I actually pull a lot of their models into this conversation today because I think that the WESOLI guide really does allow for the reduction of the impact of unconscious bias when reviewing and preparing materials for either scholarships, grad schools, or jobs. And the next couple of slides are really just showing you those areas that you should ensure your evaluation criteria is set prior to reviewing those applicants. You need to have those clear expectations. That before reviewing, take a moment to engage in counter stereotype imaging. So before you start writing a letter for someone, maybe imagine a counter stereotype image to really reduce the influence of assumptions based on that common stereotype. In addition, take your time when you're reviewing this, right? Biases are often intensified when you're rushed or you're mentally drained or you're hungry, and goodness gracious, haven't we been all going through this panicked pandemic kind of perspective, the sense that we've all had this. So give yourself a little bit of grace. Think about the similarities that you have with the applicant, not just the differences. You can't change the negative biases towards people that are not part of your in-group, but you can expand your in-group to include more people, and that'll help with letter writing as well as review. Take breaks. Consider reviewing your initial evaluations at a later time or from a different perspective. Discuss your evaluation decisions with other individuals or committee members and think clearly through it. Give yourself a little bit of exploration time. Treat every applicant as an individual and evaluate it as an individual instead of as a representative of a group. And tell your other committee members of the biases that you've been made aware of. Like, think about what you've done in the past and give space to those. Hold yourself accountable for it. Because that means that when you're starting to write your letters, that you will be able to kind of avoid that gender bias in reference writing. That you are going to mention research and publications. That you aren't going to just write a short letter. Letters for men are 16% longer than letters for women. And letters for women are 2.5 times as likely to make a minimal assurance rather than a ringing endorsement. You're going to emphasize accomplishments, not just effort. Letters for references for men are more likely to emphasize those accomplishments, right? While letters for women are going to include those grindstone adjectives, right? The recognition that we all share bias. It's important to remember that unconscious gender bias isn't a male problem. Research shows that women are just as susceptible to these common pitfalls. It's a problem for us all. Let's solve it together. And of course, we're going to keep it professional. We're going to think about, instead of just letters of referencing 7 times more likely to mention personal life, we're going to really think about formal titling and surnames for both men and women. We're going to stay away from stereotypes like caring and compassionate and helpful for women because they do evoke hurtful gender stereotypes. And we're also going to be careful about raising doubt because it isn't about saying, negative or irrelevant comments that are going to kind of add that kind of doubt, right? We're going to focus instead on being very simple and very effective, thinking about adjectives to avoid and adjectives to include, regardless of gender or identity. And we can do this in our letters. It may add a little bit of time and it may add a little bit of effort, but it will help in the long run. And it can become part of our professional and our personal development as well. I would like to go ahead and just acknowledge and thank that the result of this presentation is the result of a presentation that I gave at the Southeast Women's Studies Association just last month. I also want to acknowledge that the Eckerd College has really allowed me to explore and to connect to these different topics and to share them with you. That the National Association of Fellowship Advisors, where I will also be presenting a similar topic, presenting on a similar topic to this in the summer, as well as that University of Arizona Commission on the Status of Women and the Women in Information Technology handout. I also urge you to take a look at the Gender Bias Calculator. It's hokey, but it's helpful. In addition, there are some additional resources here that you can take a look at, as well as the ones that are provided in the community development resource section. I look forward to talking with you guys about this work and the work that we continue to do here and we will continue to do for the future. Thanks so much and have a great day.